Hello everyone, Ace here, and today let's go ahead and talk once again about short Fat Otaku, aka Dev. It's been a good long while since I've done a video on Dev. After all, one might think that Dev wouldn't be able to top his take about Ruby Ridge being completely justified on the part of the US government. You know, when even the US government itself had to admit that it was ultimately at fault and that the Weaver household was perfectly justified in defending themselves in response. With that said, today let's talk about how short Fat Otaku just chose to defend an example of leftists bombing the US Senate, as well as far leftists doing armed insurrections, on the grounds that at least they're not 1/6, and that Republicans are in no position to condemn any example of terrorist attack or violence committed by the far left until 1/6 itself is topped. But I do believe I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so let's take it from the top. Today's excursion began with this quote tweet from Dev on February the 17th of 2025, where he stated, quote, "I do not want to hear rightoids cry about leftoid protests at capitals anymore. Until this is topped, I simply do not care. You are worse than them." It is of note that short Fat Otaku is in fact responding to Libs of TikTok, who stated, quote, "Leftist protesters at Utah State Capitol are having a complete meltdown over Trump, Elon, and Doge." Considering the actual comments from Libs of TikTok, it is very clear that she is not, quote, "crying," unquote, and if anything is actually mocking the protesters, and rightly so, for having a meltdown. But let's be honest, that is the lesser example of Dev being bad faith with this particular quote tweet. The greater example of Dev being bad faith is his claim that 1/6 has not been topped by the left. In reality, it was topped by the left far before it even happened. Naturally, as you could probably guess, this led to numerous examples of people pointing out that Dev is in fact arguing in bad faith here. There is one thread that I do believe, however, stands out as being an especially great example of just how unhinged Dev's argument is here, and how he isn't actually capable of defending it in any meaningful capacity, which again is evidence of him being bad faith. This particular thread began with Not Important responding to Dev by stating, quote, "How about an explosion in Congress, occupying SCOTUS, countless fires, assaults, murders, Chaz, Chop, and the countless riots by Antifa and BLM. All of which are, of course, things that do, in fact, top 1/6. And for additional context for those curious, the exact bombing in question that he is referring to is the 1983 bombing of the Senate by communist revolutionaries. Fortunately, no one was actually hurt in that blast, but of course the sheer act of setting off an explosive in Congress is definitely much worse than an unarmed protest that saw a handful of members become rioters, you know, after being goaded into it by government agents. Government agents that Dev admits committed treason, but treason is apparently perfectly okay for the US government to commit as far as Dev is concerned. In fact, even if open communists do it, well, according to Dev, that's still not as bad as a protest in which a handful of individuals chose to riot, after being encouraged and thus entrapped by government agents to do that. And yes, you can in fact defend something by claiming it's bad, but at least it's not that bad, which is exactly, of course, what Dev does in this conversation. And for those who think it is impossible to claim something is bad while defending it, such as on the grounds that at least it's not as bad as originally believed, well, there are some really good examples I can provide. Perhaps the most notable one is claiming that 6 million is simply too high of a reasonable number, and that 2 to 300,000 is much more likely. See, that particular argument is done to try to defend what historically happened, at least when we're talking about an actual serious argument and not someone just making very spicy jokes. But the point is, as a serious argument, this is meant to downplay what historically happened to around 6 million people by claiming that it didn't actually happen to all 6 million, and only happened to a fraction of that number, and is therefore not as bad as we thought it was before. It is still an example of defending a bad thing by claiming it's not as bad. It's an argument built upon moral relativism, similarly to how Dev is trying to argue that the left is not as bad as the right, despite all of the demonstrably worse things that the left has done. And yes, Dev Dev is essentially using the same overall strategy to defend the actions of the left here. So with that tangent out of the way, let's go ahead and actually get back to the conversation at hand. As Short Fat Otaku responds by stating, quote, "All bad, I agree. Now, do you agree with me that this was bad?" To which Dranzer responds by stating, quote, "You didn't say Jan 6 was bad, you said Jan 6 was worse. Put those goalposts back where you found them." To which Dev responds by stating, quote, "Both statements are true." So there you go, Dev is arguing that while communists bombing Congress is bad, it's not that bad. It's not even as bad as a mostly peaceful protest with a handful of rioters. And please note, 1/6 is technically a mostly peaceful protest, according to the standards set by the mainstream news media back in the summer of 2020. In fact, it was even more mostly peaceful than the events that occurred back in 2020. Events that were also worse than 1/6 and therefore topped 1/6. And on that subject, that moves me quite cleanly to the Chaz, which was technically an armed insurrection with actual guns, unlike 1/6. And for the record, even Dev himself has openly admitted in the past that the protest of 1/6 was not actually an insurrection. He's openly had to admit that the government was lying about that particular claim. Not that I expect Dev to admit that now, because it would be an extremely inconvenient fact to point out for him. And when faced with extremely inconvenient facts, Dev tends to choose to run and hide, as well as censor people on his free speech platform for daring to engage in wrongthink. Wrongthink including suggesting the idea that Dev is anything other than 100% honest all the time. As a good example of this, to finish this particular thread, Skyblade responded to Dev by stating, quote, "So you seriously believe that Jan 6, an event where the only death was an unarmed protester, was worse than bombing Congress?" This, of course, is a question that Dev never chose to answer, because doing so would expose him for being the disingenuous and ontologically evil monster that he truly is. It's also a great example of just how utterly tribalistic Dev is and how much he is ultimately anti-liberal, as well as anti-centrist, despite his claims to the contrary. Now, for those curious, I will of course be providing a link in the description below to the Twitter thread itself in its entirety, so you can check it out for yourself if you should so desire. I will also be providing a link to one of my earlier videos where I discuss in depth some of the things that I have brought up here that Dev has stated in the past, again for additional context. Now, do I believe that this is the end of Dev making bad takes? Sadly, no. Do I believe that Dev is going to be able to top this particular bad take? Sadly, yes. The man is becoming more and more unhinged every single day at this stage. It is very clear that there are two key issues at play here. The first being Dev's ego, making him absolutely unwilling to admit when he is wrong, even when caught with the most blatant evidence proving he is wrong. He'll lie, he'll make excuses, and he will do his damnedest to talk his way out of it, and should all of that fail, he will gladly censor anyone who dares accuse him, very rightly so, of being bad faith. This leads me quite cleanly to the second major factor at play. Dev's behavior has turned his online presence into an echo chamber. He has increasingly become surrounded by a bunch of yes men who happen to be democratic socialists, and is becoming increasingly radicalized and tribalistic as a direct result. The man is getting audience captured in his efforts to try to prevent audience capture from the right, and as a result he's only going to continue to spiral further and further until he finally admits he is in fact wrong. An admission that is going to become harder and harder for him due to a sunk cost fallacy of spending so much time doing his best to deny reality, and his ego is going to suffer that little bit more the longer he takes to admit he was wrong. All of this is to say good luck in getting Dev to admit that he's wrong at this stage, because that's not something I expect to reasonably happen anytime soon. Instead, it's far more productive and far more practical to simply humiliate Dev over and over again along with his ever-shrinking band of supporters, to render him increasingly irrelevant and impotent, and to reduce him to nothing more than an example of what not to do. Such a strategy has very much borne fruit as far as I'm concerned. And as far as I can see, such a strategy will continue to bear fruit in the future as well. But in any case, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.